Josh Fenton, CEO and co-founder, and there is a lot of news this Friday. Before we go down to the University of Virginia and Jennifer Lawless, the chair of the Political Science Department, Gina Raimondo's home sold again, this time when she sold it while going to Washington, D.C., sold for about $1.2 million. It almost doubled in price this time. I don't know what that says about the market or the house, but you can read all about it on GoLocal. Now, let's go talk to Jennifer Lawless. She's the chair of the Political Science Department at the University of Virginia. Professor, thanks so much for joining us.
I'm happy to, although not from a $2.4 million home, unfortunately.
Almost doubled, almost doubled. Let's chat about Hunter Biden. He got some bad news late yesterday, leaked out that the special prosecutor is leveling him with 9 new charges in federal court. Talk about that, the implications for not only Hunter Biden, but much more importantly for the President of the United States.
Well, the news for Hunter Biden is obviously bad, especially because just a few months ago, he was under the impression that a plea deal had been reached, he would avoid jail time, and given that he had paid back the very significant sums that he owed to the IRS, he thought that this was basically going to go away, and that's not the case. So it's very likely that he will be convicted. He's basically said he's done these things. I don't think that this is that problematic for Joe Biden in terms of the merits of his campaign, but I can imagine that it's going to take a pretty substantial psychological toll on him, because every time the Republicans try to bash Joe Biden and try to claim that he's not fit for office or shouldn't be reelected, they're obviously going to also be talking about Hunter Biden and trying to conflate Hunter Biden's legal woes with those of Joe Biden. And for any parent, I think that that's a difficult path to have to endure.
Isn't it though? Joe Biden can't say this, but his team can. Can it really say that? Listen, the Justice Department under Joe Biden goes after crimes equally and appropriately as it needs to uphold the laws of the United States. And it doesn't matter if you're the president's son or the former president or a drug kingpin or whomever you are, under Joe Biden, there's no interference in the Justice Department.
Yes, and politically, it's a message that's quite helpful to the campaign, especially because they're going to be making the argument that Donald Trump has already said that he plans to use the Justice Department and all of the other levers of government as a way to, exact revenge on his political opponents. So this actually helps them draw that distinction. The campaign will do that. The campaign will emphasize that. But I think Joe Biden as a person, as opposed to Joe Biden as a presidential candidate, is probably going to find that very difficult to endure, because this is his son, and we know how close he is to his son. We know how close he is to his family in general, the kinds of losses that he's already endured, and it's just a tough thing for any person to deal with on a personal basis.
I saw the talking heads this morning. The Biden messaging was not that. It was convoluted, inconsistent, somewhat critical of the Justice Department, citing the attorney for Hunter Biden, who said if his name wasn't Biden, these charges wouldn't have been levied. The Biden team doesn't seem to be able to, when they have the opportunity to communicate an important message, actually do it.
So 2 things. The first is we've now seen over the course of the last 3 years that it generally takes the team a while to figure out what the appropriate message should be.
What about 3 years?
Yeah, so I mean, this is just par for the course. The other thing that I would say that does complicate things a little bit is the campaign's message is going to run counter to Hunter Biden's message and his defense. So he is on stronger footing if he can make the case that this was a political vendetta. The Biden campaign is on stronger footing if they can say this has nothing to do about politics. And obviously, those 2 things, are not consistent. They're not running on parallel trends. So it's going to be tricky, but I'm not at all surprised that the Biden team botched it, 24 hours out. I'm somewhat hopeful that within a few days, they're going to figure out exactly what they want to say.
Let's go down to Congress. This week there was riveting and shocking testimony by 2 presidents of Ivy League schools, Penn and Harvard, as well as the president of MIT. None of them seem to be able to articulate that someone calling for the genocide of a religious group, an ethnic group, or those who come from a particular country was wrong. They were criticized not only by the Republicans who were hosting this hearing, but by everybody from Governor Shapiro, a Democrat from Pennsylvania, to noted law professor Lawrence Tribe, pretty much horrified everyone in the country. What went so terribly wrong for these three presidents?
Well, I'm going to date myself here, but I'm sure some viewers might remember when Michael Dukakis ran for president, and he was asked during a debate in 1988, even though he was against the death penalty, what he would do if his wife, Kitty Dukakis, was raped. And he responded by saying, well, Bernard, it was Bernard Shaw, well, Bernard, that would be terrible, but I'm opposed to the death penalty. And he was incredibly robotic, demonstrated no sense of empathy. And people were like, this guy is totally out of touch with human emotion. And as I was watching the footage, that was what I saw. And that was the first thing that I thought of. The college presidents came across as very literal. You know, they're referring to specific codes, they're referring to specific statutes, they're talking about the context in which calling for genocide might be okay versus not be okay. And it just sort of seemed robotic and out of touch with the way that most Americans feel right now. Whether you're a Jewish student, whether you're a Palestinian student, whether you're just watching this from afar, there seems to be something fundamentally wrong with the way that a lot of higher education is handling what's going on in the Middle East right now. And for these college presidents to be sitting there and, you know, be parsing definitions and, you know, coming up with contextual dependent answers just seemed to reinforce everything that people already think is wrong with higher ed, and elite higher ed in particular.
The president of Wesleyan was on CNN this morning. While they were introducing him, he said, interrupted them. They had not even completed their introduction of his name and title, and he said, it's wrong. Let me just start right there. It's wrong. So he got the joke. He got it. Do any of them fall, of these presidents? They're all women. 6 of the 8 Ivy League presidents now are women. The president of MIT is a woman. Does 2 of them are black, I believe, white down at Penn. Do they survive because of gender and race? Because if it was white guys, I think they'd have been out about 7 minutes after they completed their discussion. How does this roll out?
Well, 2 things I would note here. The first is that I think it's unfortunate that the group of college presidents called in were all women, because it, you know, I think it's great that there's been so much progress and we now have these female presidents. I think, unfortunately, if anybody is looking for an excuse or looking for a reason, gender dynamics now come into play, when I don't think gender had anything to do with this whatsoever. They should be treated and they should be evaluated the exact same way that a male president would be. The other thing I would note that I think played into the gender dynamics here is Elise Stefanik, who's clearly, you know, angling to be the next Speaker of the House. The Republican Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, who is not on the committee, was brought into the committee as a guest and engaged in the harshest questioning. It's hard to imagine that.
Was that even harsh, though? I mean, it was complete.
She was yelling at
it was
them, right?
competent.
So I don't think the substance was
Lawrence
harsh, but
Tribe,
I think the tone and the
do
delivery.
you know Lawrence Tribe? I believe Lawrence Tribe
Yes.
is said, tweeted repeatedly, I don't agree ever with Stefanik, but she was dead on in her questioning, was his communication.
I agree with him. What I would say is that the Republicans have learned a lesson and they were smart. It was much more effective for her to be engaging in that questioning than a 70-year-old white man.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I do think that there were gender dynamics at play, and in part, the way she was able to not get the answers she wanted from them was because she was able to, you know, pretty hostily go after them in a way that a man might have been more concerned about the optics. So, you know, those kinds of gender dynamics we've seen time and time again. But at the end of the day, the reality is they did not come across well. And it's hard to find anybody who believes that their standing improved after their testimony. Now, what that ultimately means for their positions is unclear. And I don't like the fact that a lot of very, very wealthy donors are now calling for them to be removed because it should have nothing to do with what donors want. The college president should not, and the way that the boards of trustees behave should not be contingent only on, what the wealthiest voices are calling for. That said, we know that that's going to be part of the calculus.
You clearly work for a state university, not a Ivy League institution presently. Let me just
top
go
state
back.
University, top state university.
Let me just go back to Stefanik's shouting. One of her questions, and I'm pretty much verbatim, is yes or no, do you condemn calling for the genocide of Jews? I mean, that was her question.
She also asked whether the code of conduct at each university allows for calling for the genocide of the Jews. This does
But
not
that was
seem
a
to be
separate question.
Right, no, but that
question.
too
Yes
does not
no?
seem to be a complicated question.
Okay.
I don't think she was asking hard questions. She did not get straightforward answers.
Do they survive?
I think at least one will, and my bet is at least one won't. How's that for really hedging?
Let's go over to how this all fell within the context of the war between Hamas and Israel that is now playing out. The overwhelming reaction of students on campuses, the rebuffing of those by many Jewish students at colleges across the country, saying they feel threatened. How is all this playing out from a national political dynamic within the context of Congress and the president and the re-election of Joe Biden, in all likelihood against Donald Trump?
I think the most straightforward electoral implication is what this means for young voters. And young voters are significantly less enthusiastic about Joe Biden than they were last time around, and more inclined to say that they plan not to turn out. It's not that they're going to vote for Donald Trump. It's that they're going to be disengaged because they don't think that there's a meaningful difference between the Democratic and Republican parties on this issue, and they're not sufficiently enthusiastic about the Democrats' positions on a host of other issues. And so
is this Humphrey Nixon?
I'm sorry?
Is this analogous to Humphrey Nixon, where Hubert Humphrey was picking up the mantle as the vice president, aka Joe Biden? So much anti-war protest, many young voters didn't see Hubert Humphrey as that big a difference from Richard Nixon and stayed out of that election?
I think on this particular issue it is. What complicates things a little bit for the Republicans, who should probably be happy that this is, where the young people are right now, is the issue of abortion. And we've seen, especially among young voters, that has been, when the rubber meets the road, something that does motivate them to turn out. So I don't think that the writing is on the wall yet, but it's certainly a problem. The other thing that I would say, though, is that what we're seeing on these college campuses, and I think it's important to note, too, that we're not seeing what we're seeing necessarily at Harvard and Penn across the board entirely. Cornell had anti-Semitic violence and handled it. I can say personally at UVA, on an almost daily basis, there are workshops and discussions and guest speakers trying to educate people about Hamas, about the Palestinians, about Judaism, about Israel, and trying to provide at least the basic background, because what people are getting from the news, what people are getting from a cursory look at what's going on, is not necessarily sufficient. And it's not sufficient for them to differentiate supporting Jews versus supporting Netanyahu. It's not sufficient for them to differentiate Hamas from Palestinians in general. And, I think this is an opportunity where our, places of higher education should be providing background information that the youngest generation just tends not to have. So it is an opportunity. I don't know how well it's going to pan out. But it's going to also be up to politicians to make that clear and to make the case. And what we're seeing among, Democrats now is a move toward saying that, Netanyahu can't do whatever he wants under any circumstances.
Right.
And I think that that's a little bit different than it was 3 weeks ago. And my bet is that that's going to be the direction in which the Democrats move. We're still a year away from the election, and people have very short memories. So if the Democrats and the Republicans are able to create some light in between them on these policies, that might be one way to motivate younger people to sort of come back on board.
We are 11 months from the next election. We are roughly 40 days away from the Iowa primaries, the GOP had another debate. Nikki Haley had some good moments during the course of that debate, but rubber will hit the road in 30-something days. Can Nikki Haley finish second to Donald Trump in Iowa?
No, I mean, maybe, but I watched the debate. I watched the full 2 hours of it, and I think Chris Christie had the best line, which was that we're spending all of this time having the candidates fight with one another and differentiate themselves from one another. And Ramaswamy's attacking Haley, and Haley's differentiating herself from DeSantis, and DeSantis is saying he's not Chris Christie. None of it matters. It's all about Donald Trump, and Donald Trump is up 40 points in Iowa. So maybe she can come in second. I think it's unlikely. Maybe she'll come in second in New Hampshire, but a second place finish that's 40 points off from the leader is not the same thing as a second place finish where you can potentially parlay that victory into a victory in the following state. And so it's just hard to see how Trump doesn't just take this nomination and run with it.
She finishes second and upsets DeSantis, who's been up in Iowa nearly nonstop for a year. She goes to New Hampshire. This is her best case scenario. She edges out and finishes second, but maybe it's a little bit closer than in Iowa. She then goes down to South Carolina. She has a good night in South Carolina. Chris Christie by then maybe drops out. Swami's out. Is there any path for her to narrow this down and make it a two-person race?
I think that's her best shot. She probably can make it a two-person race. Of all the people on the stage right now, she's probably the best situated to make it a two-person race. But is it a two-person race if it's a 70-30 race? Is it a two-person race if it's a 60-40 race and that 60 isn't moving? And I think that's sort of where we are. Not to mention the fact that, moving into Super Tuesday, although the whole anti-Trump contingent would potentially back her, it's unclear to me that among Republican primary voters, they're enough to actually, matter. And the other thing that I would note too is Donald Trump has not really been campaigning.
Right.
He has not, he hasn't been attacking her. He makes his offhand comments about all of the candidates, but she's gotten through and she's, positioning herself to move into second place. Among these people on the stage, we haven't seen a two-person contest, and I would not underestimate him.
Speaking of Donald Trump, which we hadn't really mentioned yet, on Monday, I believe he's scheduled to be in a New York courtroom. This is the civil state case against him regarding his allegedly greatly overvaluing his real estate and realizing the benefits of that. What's that look like? Is that Monday or Tuesday? What does that look like, and does that have any implications to this race?
It's really interesting because the assumption is that he is going to testify, although I have been reading some commentary from lawyers who suggest that we should not assume that, because once he is then open to cross-examination, everything that he says is likely perjury. And they can basically ask about any lie he's ever made in any context to demonstrate that he doesn't answer questions truthfully. And, are his lawyers going to open him up to that? We don't know. It seems like the best case scenario for Trump at this point is that he'll be fined about $175 million and be told that he can't conduct business in New York. The worst thing is that number could go up pretty substantially by a couple $100 million. But the decision has already been made. I mean, whether there has been fraud has already been rendered a yes. So the question now is just how much is it worth to him to, try and get that number lower?
I believe the last count that I had seen in the Washington Post in their Pinocchio scores was that he had lied 20,000 times during the course of his presidency. Do you think that prosecutors would go through all 20,000 of those detailed misstatements and lies?
I think they'll probably just get like a random number generator and pick out their, some greatest hits.
Let's go to the sort of tenor of the country. Depending on your perspective, there's another good jobs numbers, almost 200,000 new jobs created in the U.S. economy. Unemployment's at 3.9%. That is good news for the average working person, maybe, because it also indicates that the economy is still extremely strong and that inflation continues to be a problem. So for first-time home buyers, it might be an indication the Fed sees those numbers and says, yeah, we're not dropping rates. this quarter. Is that the trap of this really kind of new economy we live in post-COVID, in which good numbers can also be bad numbers are actually good numbers? And is that going to be a significant problem for Joe Biden as this race continues?
I don't know if it's a significant problem, but because it's more complex, we've heard this week a lot of things are context specific and complex. Because it's so complex, it means that a strong economy doesn't necessarily lead him to a victory. So if you were just looking at these numbers in a pre-COVID environment, you would say that the economy is sufficiently strong and we've seen sufficient growth, that this is a no-brainer. If it's the economy stupid, Biden gets reelected and Democrats generally do quite well. The numbers are more complicated than that. They don't all move in the same direction. And, I just read a statistic that the average home buyer now, I think, is like 49 years old. That's 20 years older than the average home buyer had been a generation ago. And that doesn't help with younger voters. That doesn't help with people who feel like, oh, they moved back to their parents' basements during COVID and they've been unable to get out, and they also can't even afford rent. So, it's difficult to figure out exactly how this is going to pan out. The Biden administration has not really helped with messaging on this front. Every time they tout a good number, it looks like they're tone deaf and ignoring the fact that inflation is still a problem. So, I think it's anybody's guess. But at this point, I don't think it'll necessarily hurt Biden, but I don't think he can count on it the way that previous incumbent presidents have been able to.
Going forward, what should people be looking for in Washington and its implications in these political races?
Well, the first thing that I would look at is what's going to happen. Is Congress going to leave without, basically providing any aid to Ukraine? It looks like it's possible. What did the Republicans accomplish in this past year? And, first with McCarthy Speaker and now with Johnson, other than getting rid of George Santos, it's not like they've actually achieved that much. And George Santos now, by the way, doing his cameo appearances online, has made more in just a few days than his entire congressional salary. So I'm not sure if that's a loss for George Santos either. They just don't seem to be able to get it together. They don't seem to be able to accomplish anything. And it looks like there's now additional splintering within the Republican Party, and that, Speaker Johnson's honeymoon is basically over. So, I'd be looking forward to see what are these people going to leave having done when Congress recesses, and how many people domestically and globally are they basically going to be leaving in the lurch?
Will they get Israeli aid done? Will they get Israeli aid done without some type of border legislation?
The Republicans say that they won't. And, they've dug their heels in on other issues that seem kind of crazy to me. If they really care about Israeli aid, and they're the ones that really care about it, why are they? I mean, Democrats do too, obviously, but, this is something where the Democrats and the Republicans don't differ that much. Why would they be fighting with one arm tied behind their own backs? It doesn't make any sense to me strategically. So I don't know.
Do they pick up allies in this bizarre world of politics, like AIPAC, the biggest political action committee for Israel? Do they then become advocates for border control in order to get a funding package through?
I think it seems kind of unlikely. Also, the Republicans don't actually have a plan for border control.
Correct.
So, it's a nice line for them to say that they're not going to, protect what's going on in the Middle East and not protect their own borders, but they have no sense of how to protect their own borders or what this allocation would actually do. It was similar watching the debate the other night. Ron DeSantis says things like, we're going to end Obamacare. We're going to have something better. We're going to build a wall. Trump didn't do it. We're gonna. How? And, the Republicans in Congress are doing that same thing.
We'll stay tuned for much, much more. As always, Jennifer Lawless, Chair of the Political Science Department at the University of Virginia. We always appreciate her expertise. Stay tuned for much, much more. Throughout the day and into the weekend, it has been pretty much nonstop, 24/7 here in the Rhode Island news. Everybody enjoy the weekend. Big games, Army-Navy up at Gillette, as well as a key interstate rivalry on Sunday. Brown travels to Providence College, see if PC can get back on track, and we'll see if Brown's victory over URI was just an aberration or if they're on a new streak. Thanks, everybody.